Do you know who Henry Frankenstein is and who you are?
Yes, I know. Made me from dead. I love dead. Hate living.
You're wise in your generation.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer and engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. Before Hollywood was the movie capital of the world, there was New Jersey. That's where Thomas Edison was developing new ways to capture images in motion. Movie production's eventual westward movement owes largely to Carl Laemmle, founder of Universal Pictures, who won a Supreme Court case against Edison in 1915, thereby dismantling the Edison motion picture monopoly. The move to Hollywood gave filmmakers virtually year-round sunshine, diverse landscapes for filming, and plenty of land to build their sets and sound stages. Today's guest is dedicated to preserving and sharing this important history.
We're delighted to talk with Antonia Carlotta, a film historian and niece of Universal Studios founder Carl Laemmle. She explores her great-uncle's legacy on her YouTube channel and website, Antonia Carlotta Presents Universally Me. Antonia, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Hi, thank you for having me.
What inspired you to take on the responsibility of keeping the Laemmle legacy alive?
That is a great first question. I think it was a little bit of a slow burn for me. I can't say that my entire life I had a full understanding of the work that Uncle Carl or any of my other relatives had done. It probably wasn't until I was a teenager that I started learning, facts about them, right? I had maybe known, I had this general idea that my family worked in the film business, but I suddenly, as a teenager, really started understanding, my great uncle started Universal Studios, like the Universal that I can go to and watch movies from. And he won a Supreme Court case against Thomas Edison, and he invented the idea of the movie star and he invented the movie studio tour. And then he saved hundreds of Jewish refugees as the Nazis were coming to power, and all of that was happening. And I think that I was just more and more amazed all the time at all of the things that Uncle Carl had accomplished. And then I felt like it was such a travesty that, I hadn't heard of him. I didn't know these things, and I was related to him. And anybody that I would tell hadn't really heard of him and didn't know anything about him. And all of that just culminated in this need for me to share his story and continue his legacy and just talk about it to anybody that I could.
There's a wonderful story about how he coined the name for the studio, Universal. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the story goes that as he was trying to think of the name for his new studio, he looked out a window and saw a truck go by that said Universal Pipe Fittings. And he just had this aha moment of, those are the kinds of movies I want to make. I want to make universal movies for everybody. And the name stuck.
In 1915, Carl Laemmle opened the world's largest motion picture production facility, Universal Studios Hollywood, on a farm in the San Fernando Valley. This bold move paved the way for other studios to migrate from the East to Hollywood. What was Laemmle's role in creating the Hollywood film industry?
He never did anything halfway. I'll start there. When he purchased the ranch in California, he didn't just say, I'm going to open up a studio, but he decided he was going to make a full movie making city. So he created Universal City that had anything a city would have: a school, a hospital, its own police force, fire department, post office, restaurants, etc. And every building also functioned or doubled as a film set or a facade for making movies. And people lived on the Universal backlot. My Aunt Carla grew up living on the Universal backlot. So it was a full city people thought he was absolutely nuts when he was pouring so much money into this city. They thought he was just going to fall flat on his face, but it ended up being this brilliant move, and it's exactly where Universal stands today.
Do you have any idea of how he got the capital to purchase that land?
For the most part, I think that Uncle Carl, it was all this slow build because he had started, he immigrated to the United States from Germany when he was like 17 years old. He worked all sorts of odd jobs. He had really that, I don't know, traditional immigrant story of just trying to make it. He worked in a pharmacy and he worked on a farm in South Dakota for a while. He lived in Chicago for a bit, and then he was in Oshkosh, Wisconsin for like 12 years, where he was managing a clothing store. And he saved up over those 11 or 12 years, like $3,000. And it was after he had a wage dispute with his manager that he just kind of impulsively quit and decided he was going to go into business himself. So he goes back to Chicago. He thought he was going to go into like five and dime stores. He had this idea of selling just small items to lots of people. And while he was looking for a space to do that, he saw his very first theater. And he saw the line of people outside. He kind of starts doing the math. He goes in himself for the day and he starts getting really excited about movies, which almost is the same idea, right? It's like he's giving this one product to as many people as possible. So anyway, he bought his very first theater. It did so well that within a few weeks, months, he was able to open up a second theater. From there, he got into distribution. Within, I think, 2 years, he was like one of the biggest distributors in the US. Like he just kept taking what he'd made and investing it into something new or more. And he was always solving for problems that existed, right? Like he opened his theater and he was realizing that the prints that he was getting weren't reliable and he couldn't count on them to come on time or to be good copies or not to be the same print that like the guy next door had. So he decided he would get into distribution and solve that. From there, he decided he wanted to like make the movies and control what was actually coming to him to distribute to the theaters, right? So he just kept reinvesting and building and kind of filling in the gaps there. So, he opens up Universal. He had combined, sorry, this is such a long answer, but because he had started his first film company, originally called the Yankee Film Company, became IMP, the Independent Motion Pictures Company. That's the company that he had as he's going head to head against Thomas Edison. Edison has the trust. Carl goes independent. In the middle of the trust fight, Thomas Edison sues Uncle Carl 289 times. Uncle Carl starts putting all the money he has into actually fighting Thomas Edison, where a lot of other people would just had to fold or give in or, I don't know, disappear. Carl starts fighting them. And in the middle of this fight, this is in 1912, he combines with a couple other companies, and that's what becomes Universal. And then that money, once he's making those movies, is what he puts into Universal City.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe. Universal's first successful horror movie was 1923's historical drama The Hunchback of Notre Dame, starring the man of a thousand faces, Lon Chaney. Universal would go on to define the horror genre with The Phantom of the Opera, Dracula, The Invisible Man, The Mummy, The Wolfman, Frankenstein, The Bride of Frankenstein, and more. What are the origins of the Universal monsters?
I think that when we go back to The Hunchback of Notre Dame or even The Phantom of the Opera, I'm not sure that Universal was thinking of those purely as horror films at the time. And honestly, horror as a genre didn't even exist in those times. I do think Universal was dipping its toes into these sort of fantastic characters or amazing creatures. But with those movies, I mean, first, they tended to be marketed more as like shocking romances than horror or, that kind of vibe. But anyway, it was really then towards the end of the 1920s as Junior Laemmle is taking over Universal that they start really experimenting with shockers or horror films, thrillers. And then the Universal monster franchise legacy starts with Dracula. And I guess to give a little more background there, Uncle Carl started Universal Studios and was running it, but his son Junior, he started really training from a young age to take over his place as the head of Universal one day. So Junior Laemmle grew up on the Universal backlot. He was learning the business from a really young age. And unlike almost everybody else in the film business, like he was the first, second generation, film, I don't know, mogul. And he was probably the youngest person in the industry that really had knowledge of it. So for his 21st birthday, Uncle Carl gives him control of Universal. He becomes the head of production, and he gets to choose which direction they go. And when Uncle Carl was in charge, his the way he wanted to run it was he wanted to make as many films as possible per year. He really wanted to keep a low budget, and he wanted the widest, most universal audience for all of his movies. He never took out loans. He was very, frugal and watched his pennies. When Junior takes over, Junior decides he wants to make fewer movies each year. He wants to make them way bigger, a much bigger budget. And one of the first things he really wants to dive into are horror films. He had always really had this love of the macabre and dark and mysterious things. And where Universal had made movies like The Hunchback or Phantom of the Opera, The Cat and the Canary, those were all still very earthly movies. They all had, a very logical explanation to them. But Junior wanted to make Dracula, which was the first supernatural horror film. You can't just explain that away. So now it's this movie in the Great Depression too, when not as many people are really going to the movies all the time, that instantly is going to ostracize, huge segments of the population. They're not going to go see it. But, though Junior and his dad butted heads, Junior really stuck to his guns. He really felt it was right. And he was right. Dracula was a huge hit. Instantly, Junior turns his attention to Frankenstein. He says, all right, we're going to do the same thing all over again. Let's start making Frankenstein. His dad still wasn't on board yet. He just thought maybe Dracula was a fluke. Maybe, this one, that's going to be the one that people don't jump on board for. But again, people were into Frankenstein, huge hit. And that really launched then the whole Universal monster legacy. So you have the Mummy, the Invisible Man, the Bride of Frankenstein. Moving forward, you get the Wolfman and the Creature from the Black Lagoon and all of it. And all the other studios started jumping on board too. They thought Universal was pretty crazy for making these horror films at first. Once they see how well they do, all of them start making horror films too.
There seems to be a father-son sort of legacy in the horror genre, if we want to call it that, with Lon Chaney and Lon Chaney Jr. and Carl Laemmle and Carl Laemmle Jr. Probably others that don't share the same name that I'm not thinking of at the moment. But this idea of sort of these historical figures who really were contributors and witness to the development of a whole new genre is pretty fascinating.
Obviously, I think about the father-son legacy so much with Uncle Carl and with Junior. I haven't necessarily thought about how that extends to other duos, but knowing what I know of Lon Chaney Jr., I'm sure that he felt like he had a giant legacy to live up to. I think he likely struggled with that. I don't want to speak for him, and I don't want to speak on something that I'm not positive about, but I know that he didn't have it easy in his life. With Junior and Senior, I do know that Junior wanted nothing more than to make his dad proud, but I know that they butted heads as progressive and ahead of his time as Carl Laemmle Sr. always was. It's a tale as old as time. Like his son was still progressive in a different way and thought he knew better, and they still went up against each other.
Speaking of Carl Laemmle being ahead of his time, he also hired women directors at Universal. At one point, there were 11 women directors on his payroll. This included Lois Weber, who is one of the most prolific film directors of the silent film era. Is it fair to call Laemmle a proto-feminist?
I wish and I hope and sort of, but like the early days of the film business, it was like the wild west of this brand new industry where like not a lot had been established yet. And I think it was at that time as simple as, well, these women are making me money, so I'm going to hire them. And in some ways, that in itself, like, is a feminist act, right? Like parody. But I don't think that Carl Laemmle was thinking about it in that way. I think it was, well, these women are here and they're successful, so I will hire them. But I struggle because then when I look forward to like the 1930s, I'm not really seeing women on the payroll anymore. And it doesn't seem that that was a priority for him. So, like, d- yes and no. I struggle with that, and I'm always looking for my bias wants me to be like, yes, he was the most feminist man on earth. But like, I don't know. I think when it worked for him, it was great. And then when he had other options, he went that way instead. And he did make, tons of really progressive films and films that had a good statement. I do think he had a strong sense of justice, of right and wrong, of good and bad. Um, he, I think, often felt that he was in this like David versus Goliath fight, whether that was against Thomas Edison or again when like the Nazi regime was coming to power. Like even in sort of the growth of his own business, when he's saying, well, other people aren't doing what they're supposed to do in their job, so I'm going to step in and do that. So much of that, I think, was guided by a strong moral compass. But I just don't know that he was logically thinking about feminism when he was hiring women.
Yeah, I've read also that he certainly was a big fan of Westerns. Growing up in Germany, he would read the dime novels and that sort of thing. And part of his persona, I guess, and you can correct me if this is incorrect, was projecting himself into the Western kind of scheme as the lone sort of salvific character who picks himself up from the dirt and becomes a success in this sort of heroic image that I think he resonated with in the Westerns as well.
Personally, I don't think I've heard that before, but I love that. I recognize that for me, Westerns is a really understudied area, like that I don't know so much about, and that I do know that he read those sort of pamphlets and things when he was living in Germany. I know that he wanted to move here more than anything. I think the only thing that held him back until he was 17 versus earlier was his mom made him promise that that he wouldn't leave her and wouldn't go to the US. And then she passed away. So his dad helped fund his trip to the US then. But yes, I know that he wanted to come here so bad. I know he loved those Westerns, but I never knew that he was, and it makes sense, like, that he was putting himself in those shoes and connecting in that way. I actually think that's really beautiful,
Yeah, I always like that image. And certainly pictures of him on horseback are always stunning.
which I have been seeing more and more of these days, which is, really fun and probably speaks exactly to what you're saying.
The rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany prompted Laemmle to save hundreds of German Jewish families by sponsoring them to come work for Universal. What can you tell us about this?
I'll start by saying that Uncle Carl felt really strongly connected to Germany his whole life, even after he left. And he would travel back often to go visit friends and family. He gave a lot of money to his hometown of Lauchheim. They had named a street after him there. Like he loved it and it loved him. But very early, he could sort of see the danger and tension bubbling up over there. There's a story of one time when he was back in Germany, he felt like he was getting, I think that this might have been after All Quiet on the Western Front came out, which he thought was going to, I don't know, not bring a sympathetic like feeling to Germany after World War One, but kind of that so many soldiers who sign up don't really know what they're signing up for, and there are no winners in war, and it had a pacifist message, and I think that he thought it was going to be received positively there, and it wasn't. Joseph Goebbels in particular thought that it made Germany look really weak, and they sabotaged screenings of the films. They released stink bombs and mice in screenings of it and stuff, and it ultimately was banned. So anyway, after that, he was in Germany. The story goes that he saw himself getting side-eyed by, I believe, some officers over there, climbed out a window of the restaurant that he was in, and never went back to Germany again. And they renamed the Karl Laemmle Strasse over there, became Hitler Strasse. So he could just see the direction that things were going, and very early was trying to bring people to safety in the United States. So he would do that by sponsoring Jewish refugees to come to the United States. He would pay for them to come over. He would sign an affidavit that said that he was in charge of them, and he would set them up with homes and jobs in the United States. A lot of those jobs were at Universal, which speaks a little bit to how he got such a reputation of nepotism there. He was bringing over friends and family and giving them jobs, and that was part of how they cared for themselves. But he also gave people totally other jobs. I know of at least, I think one person got a job at Sardi's or one of those restaurants over here. Um, there is, I believe in the Carl Laemmle documentary, somebody talks about his grandmother that Carl Laemmle bought her like a fourplex in New York where she could live in one unit and rent the other three out so that she could earn an income and live safely. So he did that all the way until the Secretary of State, I think Cordell Hull, told him that he wasn't allowed to anymore. He didn't really care that Carl Laemmle could afford to bring so many people over. He said, no, you've hit your limit. Uncle Carl started nagging every relative, trying to get them to do the same. I believe some of them did, but I don't have any of this. I haven't been able to find records of it, or I don't know how to go about that. And I mean, yeah, that was just really the big thing. And I think that the sense that I get is in those, especially earlier years, a lot of people thought that he was being almost naggy or dramatic. They didn't think it was such a big deal, calm down. And the US did have such restrictive immigration policies back then that I know that it was hard for him to get people on his side. He left Universal in 1936. He spent the last 3 years of his life, he hired secretaries full time, I think 3 secretaries full time. Their whole job was just trying to talk to the political figures in Washington, D.C., to talk them into doing more, to reach out to family members, to try to talk to them, to do more to help. Like, that's what he devoted the whole rest of his life to. Um, and then he passed away in 1939.
In the terrific documentary Carl Laemmle, written and directed by James L. Friedman, in which you're one of the interviewees, it's noted that everyone called Carl Laemmle Uncle Carl. Why was that?
I think he really was just this like happy, jovial, kind man that everybody felt close to and friendly to. I am grateful every day that as far as I've ever been able to find, like there were no people who have ever been like legitimately angry with Uncle Carl or who have felt violated or upset by him. The worst I can find is, oh, he was naggy or he was frugal or he was, these things, but never that he was a bad person. He really cared for the people that he worked with. He cared for the people in his studio. And, probably to a lot of them, he was legitimately Uncle Carl. But even to the people he wasn't related to, he felt like Uncle Carl.
How important was Jewishness to Uncle Carl?
I think that Judaism was really important to him. As far as I can tell, or as far as I've read, I don't know. I haven't been able to figure out exactly how central God was to his Judaism, but the community and culture of his Judaism was super important. He was one of the founding members in LA of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, which is a gorgeous temple in sort of the Koreatown area that still exists. He was very close to Rabbi Magnin, and I think that sense, at least I've always been raised in Judaism to believe things about like repairing the world, making the world better than you found it, questioning things that don't seem right, and sort of finding the most authentic interpretation of how to follow things and make the world better. And I feel like I see that in so much of what Uncle Carl did. I think that whether it was in his work, in his family life, or saving the Jewish refugees, it was about how can I create a strong community? How can I be there for my community? And how can I leave it better than I found it? So I think that was really central. And I think that roots in his Judaism. I mean, especially because, one of the first things he did out here in Hollywood, or not one of the first, but one of the big things he did out here in Hollywood, beyond the studios, beyond his work, was to help build a really strong Jewish community through Wilshire Boulevard Temple.
I think he stands out among the movie moguls of that generation for a number of reasons. He was a little bit older. He was a pioneer and everyone else kind of followed him and that sort of thing. But also there's, a lot of stories, and some of them are probably exaggerated, of how terrible some of these other moguls were. And yeah, I think what you're saying is true, that Laemmle really didn't get any of that stench.
No, which again, I feel really fortunate for. I think, again, he had a strong moral compass. He had a strong sense of right and wrong. And I think that he upheld himself to those standards as much as anybody else.
Your favorite movie genre is horror comedy. Any recommendations for our audience?
I have so many. Um, I would say one of the best ones is The Bride of Frankenstein. That is a great place to start. And James Whale, who was a director who worked under Uncle Carl, he was a brilliant director who had such a great sense of that horror comedy blend. A lot of sarcasm, a lot of dry jokes, really funny humor. So The Bride of Frankenstein and Frankenstein, The Old Dark House. I think The Cat and the Canary, which was a Paul Lenny film, is so funny and just really brilliantly shot. To bring it like way more modern, I love movies like Scream. I love Ready or Not. I thought the new Abigail movie was really fun, which is sort of a modern take on Dracula's daughter. So they're all great films.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Antonia. It's been a real pleasure.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to be here.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.